In a forgotten corner of the Arizona Territory, a quiet cowboy with barely enough to feed himself began bringing food to a widow's cabin every week. The townspeople mocked him, called him a fool for wasting what little he had on a woman they'd long forgotten. But when a wealthy businessman arrived in Dustwood with documents that revealed the truth about her late husband, everything changed. The man she'd mourned in silence had built half the town with his bare hands, and the legacy he left behind would shake the community to its core. Before we ride into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The town of Dustwood sat low beneath the Arizona sun, a collection of wooden buildings and dusty streets carved out of red earth and stubborn hope. It was 1884, and the territory still felt raw, unfinished, like a story half told. The Silver Ridge mine had brought prosperity once, drawing men with dreams of fortune and families seeking new beginnings. But those glory days had faded. Now Dustwood clung to survival, its buildings weathered, its people worn down by heat and hardship. Ethan Cole rode into town each week with little more than the clothes on his back and a horse that had seen better years. He was a drifter by circumstance, a ranch hand who picked up work where he could find it. His face was tanned and creased from long days under the sun, his hands calloused from mending fences and breaking horses. He spoke rarely, kept his head down, and asked for nothing he hadn't earned. But every Saturday, without fail, Ethan rode out to the edge of town where Willow Creek bent through the cottonwoods. There, set back from the road, stood a small cabin with sagging shutters and a porch that leaned to one side. Smoke rose thin from the chimney, a sign of life barely sustained. Inside lived Margaret Dawson, though most folks called her Maggie when they remembered her at all. She was 53 years old, but grief had aged her beyond her years. Her hair, once dark as midnight, had turned silver in the 5 years since her husband died. Her hands, once steady and strong, now trembled when she worked the loom or carried water from the creek. She lived alone, forgotten by a town that had moved on without her. Ethan had first seen her months ago, standing outside the general store with a small bundle of goods she couldn't afford. She'd set down 2 cans of beans to keep within her meager budget, her face carefully blank to hide the shame. He'd watched her walk back toward the creek, her shoulders bent, her steps slow. That night, he'd gone without supper himself and bought those 2 cans. The next morning, he'd left them on her porch before dawn, then ridden off before she could see who'd done it. The weeks that followed became a rhythm. Ethan would work his jobs, earn his pay, and set aside what little he could spare. Sometimes it was cornmeal and salt pork, other times a sack of potatoes or a jar of preserves from the widow Hayes, who sold them cheap. He never brought much, never anything fancy, but he brought it faithfully. Maggie never saw him at first. She would find the parcels on her porch at sunrise, tied with simple twine, no note, no name. She wept the first time, clutching the bag of flour to her chest as though it were gold. She didn't know who was leaving these gifts, but she whispered prayers of thanks to a God she thought had abandoned her. Then one Saturday, Ethan's horse went lame just as he reached her property. He had no choice but to approach on foot, carrying a bundle of smoked venison and biscuits. Maggie opened the door before he could set it down. They stood facing each other, silent. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, weary but kind. His were the brown of turned earth, steady and unreadable. "You've been the one," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded once, his hat in his hands. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. He looked past her toward the cabin, then back to her face. "Because nobody should be forgotten, ma'am." After that morning, Ethan stopped hiding. He came to Maggie's cabin in daylight now, riding up openly with whatever provisions he could spare. Sometimes it was fresh rabbit he'd trapped, other times a sack of oats or a tin of coffee. He never stayed long, never expected thanks, but Maggie insisted he sit on the porch while she poured him water from the well. The conversations were brief at first, cautious. Maggie asked where he worked, and Ethan told her about the ranches, the odd jobs, the horses he broke for men who paid in coins and suspicion. She listened with an attention that made him uncomfortable, as though his small life mattered more than it should. "You don't have much yourself," she observed one afternoon, her eyes taking in his patched shirt and worn boots. Ethan shrugged. "I got enough." "Enough to give away?" she asked gently. He looked out toward the creek, where the cottonwoods swayed in the dry wind. "My ma used to say that what you give comes back in ways you don't expect." I figure she was right. Maggie's throat tightened. She hadn't heard such kindness in years, not since Samuel died. The town had offered condolences at first, casseroles and sympathy that lasted a week, maybe two. Then they'd moved on, and she'd become invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of Dustwood. But the town noticed Ethan's visits. Of course they did. In a place as small as Dustwood, nothing stayed secret for long. Rebecca Shaw, who worked at the general store, was the first to speak it aloud. She stood behind the counter one afternoon, weighing flour for a customer, when she saw Ethan ride past with a bundle strapped to his saddle. "There he goes again," Rebecca said, shaking her head. "Off to the widow Dawson's place." The customer, a rancher's wife, raised her eyebrows. "Still?" "Every week like clockwork," Rebecca replied. "Bringing her food, they say. Though what he expects to get in return, I couldn't say." The rancher's wife leaned in, her voice dropping. "A man doesn't do that for nothing." Rebecca smirked. "That's what I'm saying. She's old enough to be his mother, but stranger things have happened." The whispers spread like wildfire through dry grass. At the saloon, Frank Cordell poured whiskey and shared the gossip with anyone who'd listen. "That drifter, Cole, wasting his wages on the Dawson widow. Fool's errand, if you ask me. She's got nothing to give him." One of the miners laughed. "Maybe he's got a taste for older women." Another shook his head. "Or maybe he's just soft in the head. Man barely scrapes by himself, and he's playing charity for a woman nobody even thinks about anymore." The talk reached Pastor Thomas Gray, who frowned when he heard it. He'd always thought Ethan a decent man, quiet but respectful. But the congregation had questions, and the pastor couldn't ignore them. One Sunday after services, he approached Ethan outside the church. "Might I have a word, son?" Ethan nodded, shifting his hat in his hands. "I've been hearing talk," the pastor began carefully, "about you and Mrs. Dawson." Ethan's jaw tightened. "People talk." "They do," the pastor agreed, "and I don't put much stock in gossip, but I have to ask, what are your intentions with the widow?" Ethan met his eyes steadily. "To make sure she doesn't starve, Pastor. That's all." "You're a poor man yourself, Ethan. Why burden yourself?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Ethan said simply. "She's alone. She's struggling, and I got two hands that work and a conscience that won't let me pass by." The pastor studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you, but not everyone will." "I know," Ethan said, "but I'm not doing it for them." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving the pastor standing in the dust. The whispers grew louder, sharper. But Ethan kept riding to Maggie's cabin, and Maggie kept opening her door. What the town thought didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't alone. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan's visits became more than charity. They became ritual, became comfort, became the kind of quiet friendship that needs no explaining. He'd arrive with provisions, and Maggie would insist he stay for coffee. They'd sit on the creaking porch while the Arizona sun dipped low, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. It was during these evenings that Maggie began to speak of Samuel. The first time his name crossed her lips, her voice trembled. "My husband built this cabin with his own hands," she said, running her fingers along the weathered railing. "Every board, every nail. Took him 3 months, working after his shifts at the mine." Ethan listened, his coffee growing cold in his cup. "He wasn't an educated man," Maggie continued, her eyes distant. But he had a vision for this place. Said Dustwood could be more than a mining camp. Said it could be a real town, a place families could grow roots. She paused, her throat working. He gave everything to make that happen. Over time, the stories came easier. Maggie told Ethan about the church on Main Street, how Samuel had organized the men to build it, donating timber from his own claim when funds ran short. She told him about the schoolhouse, how Samuel had worked double shifts for 6 months to pay for the teacher's salary when the town council couldn't afford it. There was a winter, Maggie said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper, when the mine shut down for 3 weeks. Families were starving. Samuel took every cent we'd saved, money we'd been putting away for our own future, and he bought supplies, flour, beans, salt pork. He distributed it himself, going door to door. Ethan's chest tightened. What did you live on? Maggie smiled sadly. What was left? Which wasn't much. We ate thin soup and day-old bread for weeks, but Samuel never complained. He'd just say, "We'll be all right, Maggie. We always are." Another memory surfaced, this one sharper. When the Silver Ridge mine had that collapse in '79, 5 men were trapped. The company wouldn't pay for the rescue effort, said it was too dangerous, too expensive. Samuel organized the miners himself. He sold our wagon, our plow, even his father's pocket watch, to buy the equipment they needed. Her voice cracked. They worked for 3 days straight. Samuel didn't sleep, didn't eat. When they finally brought those men out alive, the whole town celebrated. But Samuel came home and collapsed. He'd given so much of himself, I thought he might not recover. Ethan's jaw clenched. The town remembers this? Maggie's laugh was bitter. They remembered it for a while. At Samuel's funeral, they spoke pretty words. But memories fade, Mr. Cole, especially when there's no monument to keep them alive. She gestured toward the town in the distance. Those buildings Samuel helped raise? They're still standing. The families he fed, still living in their homes. But his name? She shook her head. It died with him. Ethan felt anger kindle in his chest, low and hot. That ain't right. No, Maggie agreed quietly, but it's the way of things. People take what they need and forget where it came from. Meanwhile, in town, the whispers hadn't stopped. They'd only grown meaner. At the general store, Rebecca Shaw served customers with a running commentary. That cowboy's still riding out to the widow's place. 3 times a week now, I hear. If you ask me, it's unseemly. Frank Cordell was more direct. Man's a fool, he said, slamming a whiskey glass on the bar. Wasting his pay on a woman who's got nothing. She can't even pay him back. But there were a few who saw it differently. Lucy Hayes, the older woman who sold preserves, defended Ethan when she heard the gossip. Maybe he's just a decent man doing a decent thing. When did kindness become something to mock? Rebecca sniffed. Kindness is one thing, but there's something strange about it, Lucy. Mark my words. Back at the cabin, Ethan stood to leave as twilight settled. Maggie walked him to his horse, her shawl wrapped tight against the cooling air. Thank you, she said, as she always did. No need, Ethan replied, as he always did. But this time, Maggie reached out and touched his arm. You remind me of him, of Samuel, the way you give without counting the cost. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he just tipped his hat and rode into the gathering dark, carrying her words like a weight in his chest. Henry Blackwell arrived in Dustwood on a Tuesday morning in a polished black carriage pulled by matched horses that gleamed like oil in the sun. The sight alone stopped traffic on Main Street. Men paused mid-step, women shaded their eyes to stare, and children pointed with open mouths. Dustwood rarely saw such wealth. The carriage was the kind that belonged in San Francisco or Denver, not a dusty mining town that had seen better days. When Blackwell stepped down, his boots struck the ground with authority. He wore a tailored suit, dark and expensive, with a gold watch chain glinting across his vest. His hat was new, his mustache precisely trimmed, and his eyes swept over Dustwood with the cool assessment of a man accustomed to appraising value. Behind him, an assistant emerged carrying a leather satchel bulging with documents. Frank Cordell stepped out of the saloon, wiping his hands on his apron. "Can I help you, mister?" Blackwell turned, his expression measured. "I'm looking for the town hall, or whoever serves as mayor in this establishment." "That'd be Mayor Hutchins," Frank said. "He keeps an office above the bank." "Excellent." Blackwell gestured to his assistant, and together they walked toward the building, their footsteps echoing on the wooden boardwalk. Within an hour, word had spread through Dustwood like brush fire. A wealthy businessman from back east, some said. Others claimed he was a railroad magnate. A few whispered he was there to buy up the town, to reopen the mines or tear everything down and start fresh. Rebecca Shaw practically ran to the saloon to share what she'd overheard. "He's meeting with the mayor right now. Something about property deeds and town records." Lucy saw him through the window, going through old documents. "What's he want with old papers?" someone asked. "Maybe he's buying up claims," another suggested. "Rich men don't come here for the scenery." That evening, Mayor Hutchins called an emergency town meeting at the church. The pews filled quickly, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, voices humming with speculation. Ethan stood in the back, his arms crossed, watching as Blackwell took his place at the front beside the mayor. Hutchins cleared his throat, his face flushed. "Folks, this is Mr. Henry Blackwell. He's come from Philadelphia with some remarkable information about our town's history." Blackwell stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "Thank you, Mayor. I'll be direct. My firm has been conducting research into Western expansion and the development of territorial towns. Dustwood came to our attention because of certain property records and construction histories that were filed with the territorial government." He paused, letting the silence build. "What we discovered was extraordinary. Much of this town, the church you're sitting in, the schoolhouse, portions of Main Street, the infrastructure that allowed Dustwood to survive, was funded and built by one man." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People leaned forward. "That man," Blackwell continued, "was Samuel Dawson." The name hit like a thunderclap. Heads turned. Voices rose in surprise and confusion. Some remembered Samuel vaguely, others not at all. A few older residents exchanged glances, memories stirring. "Samuel Dawson," Mayor Hutchins repeated, his brow furrowed. "The miner who died 5 years back?" "The very same," Blackwell confirmed. He opened the satchel and withdrew a stack of papers. "These are deeds, contracts, and receipts. Samuel Dawson financed the construction of this church. He paid the teacher's salary for 3 consecutive years when the town couldn't. He purchased the lumber for the schoolhouse and organized the labor. He funded the well that still supplies water to half the homes here." The crowd sat stunned. "Furthermore," Blackwell continued, "Mr. Dawson owned significant mining claims that were never fully developed. Those claims, according to our geological surveys, sit atop one of the richest silver veins in the territory." Gasps filled the church. Frank Cordell stood abruptly. If he owned all that, why was he living like a common miner? Blackwell's expression softened slightly. Because he spent his wealth on this town instead of himself. Every dollar he earned, he reinvested here. He built Dustwood, ladies and gentlemen, and you've forgotten him. The silence that followed was crushing. Shame settled over the room like dust. In the back, Ethan's hands tightened into fists. He thought of Maggie, alone in her cabin, struggling to survive while the town her husband built had left her behind. Blackwell wasn't finished. "I'm here to ensure Mr. Dawson's legacy is properly recognized, and to locate his widow, Margaret Dawson, who is the rightful heir to his estate." Every head in the church turned, searching the pews, but Maggie wasn't there. She never came to town anymore. Ethan's heart pounded. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the murmurs. I know where she is. The next morning, half the town followed Henry Blackwell's carriage out to Willow Creek. They came on foot, on horseback, in wagons, drawn by curiosity and shame in equal measure. Word had spread overnight. The widow they'd forgotten was heir to a fortune, and the man who'd built their town had died unremembered. Ethan rode ahead, his jaw set tight. Anger simmered beneath his skin, hot and righteous. He'd tried to warn Maggie the night before, riding out after the meeting to tell her what was coming, but she'd only stared at him with weary eyes. Let them come, she'd said quietly. It won't change anything. Now, as the procession approached her cabin, Ethan saw her standing on the porch. She wore her usual faded dress, her silver hair pulled back, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She looked small against the crowd gathering in her yard, but she didn't flinch. Blackwell stepped down from his carriage, his assistant following with the leather satchel. Mayor Hutchins dismounted his horse, his face red with embarrassment. Behind them, townspeople clustered. Rebecca Shaw, Frank Cordell, Pastor Gray, Lucy Hayes, and dozens more. Mrs. Dawson, Blackwell said, removing his hat. My name is Henry Blackwell. I believe the mayor informed you I'd be calling. Maggie nodded once. He did. Blackwell gestured to the documents his assistant held. I've come to discuss your late husband's estate. The properties, the mining claims, the investments he made in this town. You're entitled to substantial compensation. Compensation, Maggie repeated, her voice flat. For what? For your husband's contributions. For the wealth he generated that was never properly accounted for. Maggie's eyes swept over the crowd, landing on familiar faces, people who'd walked past her at the general store without a word, who'd whispered about her behind her back, who'd let her struggle while living in homes her husband had helped build. Her voice, when it came, was steady but sharp. You want to compensate me now? After 5 years? Mayor Hutchins stepped forward, wringing his hat in his hands. Mrs. Dawson, we didn't know. Didn't know? Maggie's voice rose, cutting through his excuse like a blade. You didn't know that Samuel built the church you pray in every Sunday? You didn't know he paid for the school where your children learned to read? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. You didn't know, Maggie continued, her voice shaking now with barely contained fury, that he worked himself to death so this town could survive? That he gave every cent, every ounce of strength, every moment of his life to people who couldn't even remember his name at his own funeral? Rebecca Shaw looked down at her feet. Frank Cordell crossed his arms, his face flushed. Ethan stood beside Maggie now, his presence solid and protective. His voice cut through the tension. Where were all of you when she was going hungry, he demanded. When she couldn't afford flour? When she was living alone in this cabin Samuel built, struggling to survive while you walked past her like she was invisible. We didn't know she was struggling, someone called out weakly. You didn't care to know, Ethan shot back. You were too busy gossiping about me bringing her food, calling me a fool for helping her, whispering about what I might want in return. Rebecca's face went crimson. Others looked away. Pastor Gray stepped forward, his voice heavy with regret. Mrs. Dawson, you're right. We failed you. We failed Samuel's memory. There's no excuse for it. No, Maggie agreed quietly. There isn't. Blackwell cleared his throat. Mrs. Dawson, regardless of the town's failures, the law is clear. You're entitled to your husband's estate. The mining claims alone are worth a considerable fortune. Maggie looked at him, then at the papers, then back at the crowd. For a long moment she said nothing. Then her eyes found Lucy Hayes, the older woman who'd defended Ethan in the general store. Lucy's eyes were wet with tears, her face filled with genuine remorse. Maggie's voice softened slightly. Some of you, she said, have kind hearts. You always did. But kindness buried under silence isn't kindness at all. She turned to Ethan, and her expression gentled. There's only one person in this whole town who remembered what decency looks like. One man who gave when he had nothing to give, who saw me when everyone else looked away." She reached out and took Ethan's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Samuel would have liked you," she told him, her voice breaking. "He would have called you brother." Ethan's throat tightened. He squeezed her hand gently. The crowd stood silent, the weight of their shame pressing down like the Arizona sun. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. The townspeople stood in Maggie's yard, their faces marked with shame, their eyes unable to meet hers. The truth of their neglect hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Then Mayor Hutchins stepped forward again, his voice trembling. "Mrs. Dawson, you have every right to your anger. What we did, what we didn't do, it's unforgivable." "It is," Maggie agreed, her voice still edged with steel. "But we want to make it right," Hutchins continued desperately. "We want to honor Samuel's memory properly. We could erect a monument in the town square, name the school after him, anything you want." Frank Cordell nodded vigorously. "We'll make sure everyone knows what he did for Dustwood. We'll teach our children his name." Rebecca Shaw spoke up, her voice small. "We should have done this years ago. We should have taken care of you." The offers came flooding then, one after another. People promised help, promised resources, promised remembrance, but their words felt hollow, desperate attempts to scrub away guilt with gestures that came 5 years too late. Maggie listened to them all, her face unreadable. When the voices finally quieted, she looked at Blackwell. "And you? What do you want from all this?" Blackwell met her gaze evenly. "My firm handles estate settlements. We take a percentage of recovered assets. But more than that, Mrs. Dawson, I believe in justice. Your husband's contributions deserve recognition, and you deserve what's rightfully yours." "Justice," Maggie repeated softly. She looked out over the crowd, her eyes distant. "Samuel used to talk about justice. He said it wasn't about what people deserved, but about what was right." She paused, her fingers still wrapped around Ethan's hand. "He believed in this town, even when it didn't deserve his belief. He gave everything because he saw what Dustwood could become, not what it was." Pastor Gray stepped closer, his hat clutched to his chest. "He was a better man than most of us will ever be." "He was," Maggie said, and for the first time her voice softened. "But Samuel had his faults too. He gave so much to others that he forgot to save anything for himself, for us. When he died, he left me with nothing but this cabin and memories." She looked down at her worn dress, her weathered hands. "I've been angry about that. Angry at him for leaving me this way. Angry at all of you for forgetting. Angry at God for taking him." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "But Samuel wouldn't want me to hold on to that anger. He'd say bitterness poisons the soul, that forgiveness is the only path to peace." Ethan looked at her in surprise. "Maggie," she squeezed his hand gently, "he'd tell me that people are flawed, that they forget, that they fail, but that doesn't mean they can't do better." She turned back to the crowd, her eyes sweeping across familiar faces. "Samuel built this town because he believed in second chances. He believed people could be better than their worst moments." Mayor Hutchins' voice cracked. "Mrs. Dawson, I'm not saying I forgive easily," Maggie interrupted, her tone firm again. "What you did, what you didn't do, it hurt. It still hurts. But I won't dishonor Samuel's memory by becoming bitter and hard." She released Ethan's hand and stepped forward, addressing them all. "If you want to honor my husband, don't build a monument. Don't just carve his name in stone. Live the way he lived. See the people around you. Help those who struggle. Remember that a town isn't buildings and streets. It's people taking care of each other." Her voice rose with quiet intensity. "Be better. That's what Samuel would want. That's what he died believing you could be." The crowd stood motionless, her words settling over them like a benediction. Some wept openly. Others nodded slowly, the weight of her grace somehow heavier than her anger had been. Lucy Hayes was the first to speak, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll do better, Margaret, I promise you." Others echoed the sentiment, voices mixing together in a chorus of commitment and remorse. Maggie's shoulders sagged slightly, exhaustion finally showing through. Ethan moved closer, his presence protective. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but clear. "He would have done the same thing," she whispered. "Samuel always believed in giving people a chance to be better." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He understood now. Her mercy wasn't weakness. It was the last gift she could give to the man who'd built a town on hope. The transformation of Dustwood began not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate acts of contrition. The morning after Maggie's words, Lucy Hayes arrived at the cabin with fresh bread and preserves. She didn't speak of charity or pity. She simply said, "I should have come sooner," and Maggie let her in for coffee. By week's end, others followed. Women brought meals, fabric, firewood. Men repaired the sagging porch, replaced rotted boards, fixed the shutters that had hung crooked for years. They worked quietly, respectfully, knowing their labor could never repay the debt, but offering it anyway. Mayor Hutchins organized a town council meeting to discuss Samuel's legacy. But this time he invited Maggie to attend. She sat at the head of the table while they planned not a monument of stone, but a living memorial, a fund to help struggling families named in Samuel's honor. Every month, the town would contribute, ensuring no widow, no child, no neighbor would be forgotten again. Henry Blackwell worked with remarkable efficiency. Within 3 weeks, he'd sorted through the legal complexities of Samuel's estate. The mining claims were sold to a reputable company for a sum that made even the lawyer's eyebrows rise. The properties Samuel had quietly invested in were assessed and liquidated. When Blackwell presented Maggie with the final accounting, she stared at the number written on the paper, unable to speak. "You're a wealthy woman, Mrs. Dawson," Blackwell said gently. "Your husband's investments appreciated considerably over the years. You'll never want for anything again." Maggie's hands trembled as she held the document. Tears blurred her vision. "He never told me," she whispered. "He never said anything about investments or claims. He just kept giving it all away." "He gave what was needed when it was needed," Blackwell replied. "But he was also wiser than anyone knew. He built security for you, even if he couldn't enjoy it himself." That evening, Maggie sat on her newly repaired porch with Ethan beside her. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. For the first time in 5 years, she felt something close to peace. "What will you do now?" Ethan asked quietly. Maggie was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll stay here. This cabin, this land. Samuel built it with his hands. I won't leave it." She turned to look at Ethan, her eyes clear and steady. "But I want to do something Samuel would approve of. The school needs a real building, not that drafty shack. The church needs repairs. And there are families in this town still struggling, just like I was." "You're going to give it away," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "Not all of it," Maggie replied with a small smile, "but enough. Enough to make a difference. Enough to finish what Samuel started." She reached out and took his hand. "And I want you to help me. You understand what it means to give when you have little. You'll know where the help is needed most." Ethan's throat tightened. "Maggie, I'm just a drifter. I'm nobody." "You're the man who saw me when no one else did," she interrupted firmly. "You're the man who gave from your own need. Samuel would have trusted you, and so do I." Over the following months, Dustwood changed. Not overnight, but steadily, like a river carving new paths through stone. The school was rebuilt, solid and warm. The church received a new roof and windows that let in the light. Families who struggled found envelopes slipped under their doors, unsigned but desperately needed. Ethan took a permanent position managing Maggie's affairs, But he still worked the ranches, still lived simply. The difference was that now, when he gave from abundance rather than scarcity. The town learned to speak Samuel Dawson's name with reverence. But more than that, they learned to live by his example. They checked on their neighbors, shared their resources, built community with the same stubborn hope Samuel had carried. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the sun dipped low, Maggie would sit on her porch, no longer sagging, no longer lonely, and remember the man who had built half a town with his bare hands and all of his heart. She'd think of Ethan, the quiet cowboy who'd carried Samuel's spirit without ever knowing him, and she'd whisper into the desert wind, "Thank you, Samuel. You taught them well. You taught us all." In Dustwood, Arizona territory, a forgotten widow had been restored, a town had been redeemed, and a legacy had been remembered, not through monuments of stone, but through acts of kindness that echoed through generations. True wealth, they learned, was never measured in silver or gold. It was measured in the lives you touched, the hungry you fed, and the forgotten you remembered. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.